and the first area of focus remains East and Horn of Africa. If we are able to develop this area, I think we can be able to make tremendous progress. Of course, the other areas are our traditional partners, including Europe, where we export quite a lot of commodities, including our horticultural produce, and the United States, particularly in relation to our textiles, amongst others. That's why, for example, we are interested in ensuring the extension of the AGOA regime, but also, perhaps a free trade agreement with the United States, assuming that the new administration would have the appetite for it. We are looking at the East very keenly because, look, the East is a growth arena. If you look at China alone in terms of tourism, with about, well over 12 million tourists going out every year. If we just got 200,000 of those every year, it already has a dramatic impact on the numbers that Kenya, that Kenya can get. There's a lot more that we can do in the East given that proximity. And so I think the core for us remains East Africa, East and Horn of Africa, and then the broader Africa, as we begin to look outward towards Europe, the Americas, and the East.
PS, on the question to do with the East African Community Market, you've spoken about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which of course, in recent days, we've seen it surpass Uganda as Kenya's largest export market in East Africa. But yet the kind of scenes that are coming from Kinshasa are really nothing to smile about. I mean, youth protesters attacking the Kenyan embassy over there. Do you think Kenya has fumbled in the DRC in terms of maintaining relations?
I think it's horrific to see those scenes, for sure, and very, very unfortunate. Whether Kenya has fumbled, I would say I doubt it very much. The disagreement we have had with our friends in Kinshasa really revolve around our very firm position with regard to populations within Eastern DRC. If you recall, under the Nairobi process, which was an inter-Congolese dialogue process facilitated by former President Uhuru Kenyatta, we disagreed with, or that process began to run into headwinds as a result of the refusal by Kinshasa for M23 to participate in those dialogues. The same thing holds with regard to the East Africa force that was deployed in Eastern DRC. Kinshasa's view was that we should be engaged, or that force needed to be engaged in combat with M23, a view that we resisted because it was the mandate of this mission to act as a buffer between the different combatants. And on that basis, of course, Kinshasa kicked out, rejected or refused to extend the term of the force. And as a result, we left that arena. We were replaced by the SADC, Southern Africa mission in DRC, some DRC, which has had huge problems. And so I think the position we have taken has been a firm position. It's been an open position. And we believe that it has actually been validated by the recent summit of the joint summit of EAC and SADC, which has eventually urged the Congolese authorities to enter into a direct kind of engagement and negotiation with M23 under a merged Luanda-Nairobi process. So I think it's really more to do with our disagreement with regard to how Kinshasa should deal with the challenges around M23. But I do not hold the view that we have necessarily found.
A question from Nema Mundia, who is a student of international relations at the Catholic University of Eastern Africa. She asked if Kenya's foreign policy is Kenya's foreign policy totally independent and sovereign, or does it depend on the West or Eastern powers? If sovereign, why do we still need to use the word help, quote unquote, or assist from Europe? Yet we've continuously seen that help and assistance destabilize our sovereignty. Why did our president seek assistance from the French president on the Congo case if African problems need African solutions? Could this be the reason for our loss in AU? I mean, simply questioning about preaching Pan-Africanism, but at the same time, PS dialing the West.
Yeah, not a fair representation. I think we live within a global community. Let's acknowledge that, and there are interdependencies. There are areas where one country has a comparative advantage vis-a-vis the other, and we need that solidarity with Africans, but we also obviously need solidarity with non-Africans, including our friends from the West. In the matter of DRC, it would be, I think it would be, I don't know, disingenuous to say the least, for one to completely ignore the role that Western powers have played in that geography. And because they are responsible to a large extent for the mess that DRC is in, they have a role to play. The call between President Ruto and President Macron was actually requested by President Macron, knowing that President Ruto was headed towards an ESC SADC summit, and as ESC chair, he wanted to provide perspective. And so it's really got nothing to do with begging necessarily. It's more to do with the spirit of partnership. And I think what the conversation should move towards, how do we build more equitable partnerships, partnerships that are fair to our country. And I think that should be the question. We can't run away, however, from the idea that President Ruto will talk with President Macron or the German Chancellor, or any other, or President Xi for that matter. And that doesn't make him necessarily, that doesn't make Kenya necessarily dependent on those countries. Neither does it make our policy any less, sovereignty driven.
Another question from Kenneth Wangari. He says, is it a diplomatic stance for the president to be prompt in commenting on regional and global conflicts during the infancy stages? If so, is it your considered option to continue with this diplomatic stance? PS.
I think that's a question to be, to be reflected upon, because communication, I think, is one of the aspects that sometimes can be misunderstood, and therefore, particularly, communication with regard to conflict issues or tensions or interstate tensions. But because we live in a world where communication is a 24-hour kind of business, there's always a challenge around where the balance really lies. On the one hand, you really want to inform that there is an engagement that is already taking place, and you do it out of good faith. I believe that's how the president communicates, out of good faith, to inform that there is a process that is underway. Sometimes that communication can get misunderstood, and so I think as part of our implementation process, one of the areas we will be recalibrating is around how we communicate foreign policy. And again, we invite you experts in this area to be able to give us a bit of insight and to push us forward. I really have to go at in another 3 or 4 minutes, but really this is great, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Sure, PSS, we conclude your session so that you also allow you to go and take care of other matters. You talked about multilateralism. which is a key pillar on the revamped foreign policy. And we saw recently during the weekend, Kenya's loss in the African Union Commission race, which of course was unexpected by many because your team, the secretariat that you are leading, had promised Kenyans that you are going to come back home with two flags, the Kenyan flag and the African flag. What really went wrong, and what lessons can Kenya draw from this particular experience?
Well, thank you very much. You know, I'm still smarting from the loss, okay? Because I think that we put forward a very strong candidate. I believe we put forward a very strong value proposition for the continent. Mwangi to account for these laws. But one of the clear observations, of course, to be made is that these laws is very similar to the laws by Amina Mohammed 5 years ago to Musa Faki. The only difference, the geography of who voted for us then and who voted for us now. And we are still analyzing this data. It's you know, elections are very clarifying processes because they help you understand how you are viewed, how you are viewed by others. You know, vis-a-vis how you view yourself, and therefore there is quite some scope for us to understand more how we are viewed by others now that we have two data sets to be able to draw from, you know, and to learn from. It is my view that that these elections have really helped us identify our friends, friends who are willing to make sacrifices for Kenya, and we've also been in a better position to understand countries who are friends, but we are engaged in a strategic competition with, and who therefore are anxious about our rising stature, particularly represented by a win at the AU, and therefore those countries, on account of the strategic competition at play between us and themselves, could have voted against us. And so the data that we gain from these elections will go a long way towards helping us shape the strategy of engagement with different players around the continent. But I do think, Mwangi and colleagues, that I think the country should feel confident that we are on the right trajectory, because if you're looking at a block of support by consistently over 20 countries on the continent, that says something about how you're viewed. And when you juxtapose that with the fact that the Djibouti candidates election was powered clearly by many other interests, as opposed to Kenya's candidature that was really powered, you know, by Kenya. And so I'd like to stop it at that point, because it's too early to be able to say exactly what happened. But I can tell you that this is a conversation I'd like to have with some of you, so that you can also give me your own reading. Because yes, you're right, I was very, very optimistic that we were on the winning side.
Thank you, PS. And final question before we allow you to leave the conversation. With the new US administration signaling a tougher stance on tariffs and potential cuts in foreign aid, how is Kenya positioning itself to mitigate the impact, especially in trade and diplomatic engagements with Washington?
Yeah, that's why we are looking at other markets. Of course, first and foremost, we believe that Kenya will remain a strategic partner to the United States. Already there's been a call with President Trump. There's been two calls with Secretary Marco Rubio, mainly focused on peace and security issues. It is my view that we will begin to delve into the trade and economic issues with them in the near future. There is an overall feeling and perception that the United States is de-emphasizing Africa, which then means that attracts, more private sector resources from the United States as opposed to public sector resources. Public sector resources were already very, very rare from the US, but I think if we can have more investment incoming, inward bound to Kenya from the United States, that would be quite helpful. And we are in discussion with a number of US corporations, some of whom are already players in our, in various sectors within our economy, to see whether they can expand their investment. But besides that, we of course are looking at at other destinations, and that's why I was mentioning our focus on the Middle East as an important site, for being able to draw in investment into the country, as well as our focus as well on strengthening our relations with the East. It's going to be a tight balance, I know, but I think we will continue to work strategically and in an adaptive and pragmatic way to be able to foster our national interest in this regard.
Dr. Sing'oei Korir, Principal Secretary for Foreign Affairs, thank you for your time and insights. We really do appreciate your engagement, and of course, we are looking forward to continuing the conversation as we work, all of us, to cascade foreign policy to mashinani. We have so many questions coming in. We will ensure that we take all those notes and we send over to the ministry so that you can be able to, have a feel of what the people from mashinani are saying in terms of the foreign policy, and of course the quick poll that we had done on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are Kenyans that the Kenyan foreign policy serves the national interests of the country? So they continue to keep on coming in. We will make sure that we send those notes to you. Asante sana, PS, for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mwangi, for this opportunity. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Karibu. Back to what we are mashinani, foreign policy mashinani. Our quick poll for tonight was, on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that Kenya's foreign policy serves our national interests? Well, be bold enough to drop your numbers. They keep on coming. We will make sure that we compile all these questions, all these answers that you keep on asking, so that you can be able to cascade them down to the ministry for them to have a feel of what you feel in terms of representation on matters to do with foreign policy. Now, over without wasting any other time, we have a panel of individuals who are thought leaders, very heavy panel. We have Dr. Owiso Owiso. A reminder that tonight we are discussing about Kenya's new foreign policy that has been revamped late last year. We are looking at motivations, priorities, and limitations that comes with that particular document. And we have a panel that is led by Dr. Owiso Owiso, who is an international law practitioner. We have Ms. Nanjira Sambuli. She's a researcher and analyst. She focuses on matters to do with tech policy and international affairs. We have Mr. Eliud Kibi. He's a seasoned journalist and analyst. He deals with international and diplomatic affairs. And last but not least, we have Ms. Chepkorir Sambu, who is a researcher focusing on conflict, peace, and politics in Eastern Africa. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for maintaining patience. We know that if you lose patience, you lose the battle, and we haven't yet lost the battle. Dr. Owiso, I'll come to you directly. In the past, Kenya has balanced between Western allies and emerging powers like China and BRICS. And with this particular document that was revised last year, do you see a shift in Kenya's geopolitical alliances?
Good evening, Mwangi. Thank you. And it was quite interesting for all reasons, listening to Dr. Sing'oei, who has unfortunately left us, but at least he's managed to attempt to respond to a few questions. And so directly to your question, yeah, indeed, there's a bit of a shift, but I wouldn't be ambitious enough to term it as such, because my reading of the document is that, especially in that area, it's more words than any particular policy direction that we can check from it, we can get from it. So, I mean, we certainly don't live in a vacuum, that's for sure. We must account for, changing geopolitical realities, such as the emergence of China, for instance, as one of the world's major players, attempt at realignment through BRICS, for instance, and Africa's own attempt at a free trade area, which, through the Continental Free Trade Area. These are realities, of course, that have particular impact on our bilateral and multilateral relations, be it on development, on trade, or really on any other issues on the international plane. And that's specifically so because while we have established, strong economic ties with China over the past maybe 2 decades, I would say, and now we're also trying to be quite ambitious and welcome, intra-Africa trade liberalization, which has come a bit late in the day. Our traditional, the traditional suspects like, the European states and North American states remain quite entrenched in our trade and development arena as our partners. So also when we think of, great power competition, advancements in technology, infrastructure and whatnots, we now have to contend with the reality and the fact that there are now multiple global centers and players to contend with, beyond our traditional, what we are traditionally used to. So in these circumstances, partisan alignments are certainly not in our best interest as a country, that's for sure. And we then ought to interrogate the realities of the new environment that we find ourselves in, and wherein we have to operate and figure out how exactly we will play, a balancing act. So the foreign policy, the draft foreign policy, if I can call it that, certainly identifies these realities. But to be honest, I would be hard pressed to find in that policy document a roadmap on how exactly, Kenya will or should navigate them. So maybe just say a thing or two about one prominent position in that policy paper, and that concerns China, for instance. So I note from the draft policy paper, that it's one of the few positions that have found express articulation, and of course that is understandable since it's a policy document. We can't expect it to enumerate every possible scenario. So our bilateral relations with China find a bit of a prominent place in it, and particularly the need to deepen them and to expand our ties and relations with China. And for that reason, the draft found it useful, and that is something that I find quite notable. It then goes an extra mile, of course, to actually claim that to be considered a country in contemporary arena. This is now in reference to the one key issue that China is always very concerned about, the one China policy. We say that the draft policy says, yes, we are adopting a one China policy, or we affirm the one China policy, and then goes ahead to, if I may find the quote, yeah, it is, to be considered a country in contemporary global arena, that the territory must be diplomatically recognized by 2/3 of the 193 members of the UN, including the 5 permanent members. So first, that is not correct, legally speaking, because as recognition in international law is not recognition is not a criteria for recognition of a state, or rather for the declaration of what a state is under international law. So that is not factually correct or legally correct. Secondly, this justification of Kenya's recognition was not necessary. I would have, I think it would have sufficed to simply say that Kenya recognizes a one China policy and leave it at that. Because justification in a policy document, I do think, is a bit over the top, and only it then serves to open up to more suspicion than is actually necessary, especially when we consider that yes, China is a major player in this field, but it's not the only player. Of course, we are embracing China, which is a good thing, because obviously China is one of the powers now we have to contend with. But going that extra mile, I found that a bit over the top. I think it's understandable, of course, why the policy will provide as it does regarding the one China policy. It's a major player in the international arena. It's no longer, and I think I have to correct terminology here, at least from where I sit, China is no longer just an emerging power. It already emerged decades ago. That's why we are engaging with China on a very large scale. If we were to take away our rather awkward attachment to our former colonial occupiers and their friends and allies, it may be accurate to say that today we have more engagement with China in many spheres of international life than we do with our traditional partners, so to speak. So certainly, as a country, we must have a proper policy on how we engage with China. And I would venture that merely espousing a one China policy, as the draft foreign policy does not quite cut it, in terms of providing guidance on our relations with China. And so I'll just leave that on our relations with China, but then to just add a bit on BRICS. As regards BRICS, I think it's also impressive that the document recognizes the emergence of BRICS and its position in the global order. But having said that, I do not, again, find the quality of recognition to be, as impressive. There's not much there beyond recognition that BRICS exists. That, that section reads more like, an afterthought, like something you'd put there and say, okay, some of us, you can have this, in the Kenyan parlance. So beyond recognition of BRICS' position on issues such as reform of the Security Council and IMF and its strength as a major economic and trading bloc, the draft does not quite say or suggest exactly how Kenya should take advantage of this fact. I mean, if at all. I actually sense a rather, unwarranted caution, if I may put it that way, when it comes to BRICS. Instead, the draft says that Kenya will continue to monitor the strategic significance of BRICS. I'm not sure what exactly that means, and I find that surprising because BRICS represents almost half the global population. That is literally a global majority. That to me is a major economic, trade, and social cultural bloc, if I can say that, that we as a country cannot treat as a by the way sort of thing. What exactly are we still monitoring when it comes to BRICS? It is already a major global player, and I would have expected at least the draft document to have a prominent place for our relations with BRICS, as it does with as regards our relations with other traditional partners. So to me, that's a missed opportunity. But it doesn't have to be either or. We can aggressively engage with BRICS. We can aggressively engage with China on economic, trade, and political issues, while still engaging with our so-called traditional partners. So we do not, we ought not to be drawn into our traditional partners' ideological rivalries. That is their business, that's not ours. So I would have expected the draft to have more a prominent place for these emerging or emerged or new directions such as BRICS and China. So to that extent, I'm a bit disappointed. Back to you, Mwangi. I think I've gone on, and I was waiting for you to stop me, but I'll stop at that for now.
Thank you, Dr. Owiso. And it's so interesting that you're talking about one China policy and how the Kenyan document also cuts across on that issue. We will speak about that issue later. Let's move on to Ms. Nanjira Sambuli, who the PS talks about tech diplomacy, which is of course growing globally. And the country has, President Ruto recently appointed the first ever special envoy on matters to do with tech. Nanjira, do you think Kenya's new foreign policy sufficiently addresses digital matters, sovereignty, data governance, and of course tech partnerships? From where you sit, what do you think?
Yeah, so the short answer is no, and I'll explain why. There was a draft before the publication that's now before Parliament and spoke about digital and cyberspace with diplomacy. And the framing now is broader on science, tech, and innovation. But when you read through that section, there's much that hasn't been developed or fleshed out. And it would be interesting to understand the rationale behind the narrower focus before on digital and cyberspace to this broader one on SD&I, as it's called. Though I am pleased to see the typical narrative about, M-Pesa and being a tech leader, Silicon Savannah stuff was dropped. That said, that section bundles a lot without articulating any clear priorities, and it heavily leans on the tech trends of the moment rather than on the science part. For example, there's no invocation of the National Science, Technology and Innovation Policy of 2020 and to 2030 as a guide and a reflection of what's happening on the domestic side, nor of our various ICT policies, master plans, and blueprints, and how those would contribute to that stated goal of integrating various forms of science, technology, and innovation to build a robust ecosystem, enabling Kenya to achieve her national interests and positions, and position her as a key player in the global tech discourse. So to me, it reads very vibes and inshallah. The questions like, where does Kenya currently stand on the African Union member states' commitment to invest 1% of GDP on science and technology and innovation, research and development, and our own national commitment, which is a bit higher, which is at 2%. The last statistic we had around that in 2014 was that we were spending about 0.98% of our GDP on research and development. And it also raises the question, what are our research and development priorities if we're talking about ST&I? And then there's a whole thing about, there's this framing that's very particularly curious on a broader scale with a policy around our foreign policy being global in scope, but Pan-African in nature. So I'm like, how do these STNI priorities that we've identified align with those that the African Union is pursuing with its own strategy on science, technology, and innovation? Here, and then the questions of data governance, and so on, we have had at the continental level the only convention, and that's a ratifiable convention on cybersecurity and personal data protection that has been gathering dust since 2011 when it was first brought forth and then ratified by member states. Kenya had promised to actually sign this document and still to date has not, while other countries only finally got to the minimum number of countries that would allow it to ratify about 2 years ago. The document itself is obviously out of date, and individual countries have gone about their data protection, data governance considerations very differently. But if Kenya is claiming to want to be a leader, and there's a lot of language, by the way, in this document that gives a very main character syndrome that we are either a leader, and especially where tech is involved, how are we showing that we're aligning with what's happening on the continent? And because for me, foreign policy is definitely a mirror of domestic policy. What I do see in my work is that currently with how Kenya is approaching tech, we are emerging more as a cautionary tale rather than that kind of leader in tech in Africa. We are showing more of what not to do rather than how to actually do tech, digitalization, and foreign policy. So in some, it's very underwhelming, the articulation of the whole, that whole section, including the fact that it makes no mention, funny enough, about the fact that we have a special envoy in technology, what his role is supposed to be, and it's still the only position that we've seen conferred by an African government. And there's more to science, technology, and innovation than AI and space, which the PS mentioned, and what has been the observation about what the envoy has been focusing on. So we have a lot of work to be done there, and there are other aspects that I'd love to speak to, but I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Nanjira, for your remarks. We go to Ms. Chepkoril Sambu. The PS was talking about peace diplomacy, being part of the key pillar of the foreign policy. And you've seen what has been happening lately in the Great Lakes region and in the Horn of Africa. Sudan Rapid Support Forces yesterday in Nairobi. From where you sit, Sambu, conflicts in the Horn of Africa continue to challenge, of course, Kenya's diplomatic positioning, with the kind of statement that is coming from the junta in Port Sudan calling the bluff in Nairobi. Do you think that this policy sufficiently outline how we will be able to navigate fragile neighbors while protecting our national interests? And of course, from what you have also you've been able to gather from the PS.
Yeah, thank you, Mwangi. Before I get to that question, I would first of all like to note general things about the foreign policy document that is under discussion. So, for example, I would have appreciated if at the beginning parts of the document, they had given us an explanation of the public participation process that went into creating this document. So, for example, how many people participated, what was the diversity of the people that participated, because then this goes into helping us understand the positions that the government has been taking on some of these conflicts and whether they really reflect our positions on them. And then to also say that it is full of language that is, the language is not plain, but also it has these words like Pan-Africanism, futuristic diplomacy, and everything else. But I am glad that in page, I think 68, they actually put their Kenya's country positions on strategic foreign policy issues that go into issues like Israel and Palestine, Western Sahara, Russia and Ukraine, and these other conflicts. So yes, there is that part where the foreign policy talks about the principles guiding us and the legal frameworks guiding us being Pan-Africanism, the AU Constitutive Act, the UN Charter, the EAC Treaty, as well as the fact that on issues we align with the African Union and the United Nations. But when it comes to practice, there's a problem because practice does not reflect completely what the document outlines. If you remember, the first foreign policy decision that the president made was to derecognize Western Sahara and in this foreign policy document, when it comes to looking at our country's position on this issue, it actually says that adapting country position to emerging and evolving issues, e.g. Morocco's readmission to African Union and Kenya's position on Sahrawi Republic, which means that when it comes to the Western Sahara issue, at least, unlike the Israel-Palestine issue where we have said we will align with the African Union and the UN Charter, here we are saying we're going to adapt country positions to emerging and evolving issues when there is an AU position on the Western Sahara conflict that clearly says that Western Sahara is a member state of the African Union and it has the right to self-determination. So there's a contradiction already. And then when we come to other issues like Haiti, the police is still deployed in as much as there's a lot of, there's no consensus on whether, and I mean, really, Kenyans don't support the Haiti mission. A majority of Kenyans don't support it. When you come to the Sudan issue, of course, this has been handled in a very messy way since the beginning. The president was designated as the leader of the IGAD quartet, responsible for mediating the conflict in Sudan on behalf of IGAD. But he has been making communication blunders as well as portraying behavior that shows he is partisan, even though he's a mediator. So, for example, one of the things was having the State House release a statement saying that the president's flight to his state visit in the US was sponsored by the UAE, which sponsors the RSF. And then in January, you had the president denouncing the RSF in favor of SAF. And now you have the RSF being given an avenue in KICC to hold a meeting on its plans to establish a parallel government in Sudan. I have seen the statement that was released today by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Kenya, I mean, the government is excusing what happened yesterday by saying that they support any initiatives or really any efforts towards peace, the peaceful resolution of the conflict in Sudan, and that is why they have opened up Kenya to these meetings, and even really equating the RSF to civilian efforts and civilian meetings that have been happening in Nairobi. So it's very messy, these positions, including enlisting Kenya as a non-NATO ally, even though we abide by the principles of the African Union as well as the non-aligned movement, which I think we have now really shifted from. And the fact that the reception on these issues by the public has been a lot of backlash online towards the government. People writing letters requesting information, for example, on the immunities question and the Ford Foundation letter, and even the Ministry of Foreign Affairs itself really getting into an exchange of words with Kenyans online through the letters they've been writing or the statements they've been issuing. It shows that in as much as we say all these things on the document, Pan-Africanism aligned with the African Union position and everything else, we are not practicing it. And it gives the sense that we're either being very transactional, and at the same time, this is affecting and diminishing our credibility. And finally, that means that we're not really living up to the peace and security diplomacy focus area that we have put as one of the areas in this document.
Thank you, Chepkorir. And a quick reminder to our audience is that we are going to have a Q&A session before we conclude this webinar. Please raise your hand on Zoom in preparation to ask your question. You keep it brief, please, and to the point. and kindly specify to whom your question is directed to. Thank you. We proceed to Mr. Eliud Kibi. He is a seasoned journalist and analyst on matters to do with foreign affairs and diplomatic affairs. Eliud, the PS talked about Kenya paying attention to the East African community and the Horn because of the market and peace and security being our top priority. Looking at regional diplomacy, what is Kenya's standing post-African Union Commission elections? Have we lost credibility in Africa's multilateral circles?
Thank you, Mwangi, for your question and quite good moderation. So, I would think the Kenya standing has been reducing. Of course, the previous foreign policy document, actually acknowledges EAC as Kenya's most important foreign policy vehicle, and one of given these are our immediate neighbors and among the major trading and investment countries around us. So that is acknowledged in the previous document. In this document that expands to IGAD, to the African Union, in terms of continental engagements. But I think in the past couple of years, we've seen Kenya's influence, diminishing quite fast, and we can see that especially if we were to compare with the bids that have been made by some of the Kenyan candidates. Of course, we had the Amina's bid that failed in 2017. The PS mentioned that the reasons that we lost almost the same, only the dynamics that changed. But then you ask yourself, then even if the dynamics change, why then do you almost have the same kind of grouping or the number of countries that actually feel comfortable with Kenya as a candidate or a holder of such a regional office? We also had, continentally or globally, the bid by Omamo, I think it was 2022. Despite the previous candidate coming from a small country like Togo, we were not able to capture that. We lost to Spain. Of course, we got the UNSC. We beat Djibouti, but we also had to see, Monica Juma dropping off the Commonwealth race, and the reason that was cited was the lack of adequate backing. And of course, I think that would say a lot about many of the Commonwealth countries in Africa. And I think one of the reasons why then this is happening, and of course now in terms of other interventions, the PS mentioned of the Kenya-led intervention of the EAC regional force in the DRC. There was some misunderstanding between the government in Kinshasa and the approach that the Kenya-led mission wanted to undertake. And of course, we saw the leadership, the military leadership in Sudan rejecting President William Ruto as the lead mediator within the quartet arrangement. So if you look at many of the other examples, comparatively to some years back, when you look at the Kenya's leadership in the solution within in the peace processes in South Sudan, the peace processes in Somalia, and other peacekeeping missions in Africa, you see a trend of diminishing influence. And I think I would attribute this to a couple of reasons. One is even the previous foreign policy was not as elaborate as the current, proposed or the reviewed policy, but it had all the right things that we needed to do. But then you see administrations taking positions that are inconsistent with the policy itself. For example, already we are talking about, the current documents has a lot of highlights of, respect of human rights. But then you look at the administration, and Nigeria mentioned about the reflection of domestic politics, in the international level or as a foreign policy. And the administration currently has not had a good score in terms of human rights, even on issues that touch on international law. For example, we have the Turkish the deportation or extradition of the Turkish refugees. We had the abduction of, Kizza Besigye. So you have a good document that speaks to actually what you are supposed to be doing, but the real actions in terms of conducting that policy, which is supposed to be a comprehensive guide of how we conduct international engagements and diplomacy, on the contrary. And at some point then you also get communication of this foreign policy becoming a problem. We have so many people speaking on foreign policy issues that is not centered, and we have seen this previously among cabinet members. I think cabinet has, a way of communicating government positions, but you hear cabinet members making very outrageous comments. We have Moses Kuria with the Sudan issue, and this is interpreted as a Kenyan government position. And it's not just the cabinet, but we have also had the president making remarks that are not necessary. For example, when he was, I think, in South Africa, and how he addressed the Sudan conflict of, I think the language was not good, senseless war among two generals. Well, it might be the truth, but it's not a diplomatic way of engaging. These are sovereign countries. Then, of course, the actions we've been seeing with the current administration, the policy encourages good neighborliness, non-interference. But then we here in Nairobi are hosting the M23 to launch a Congolese alliance, which is already causing trouble in the eastern part of the Congo. And once the government in Kinshasa raises these issues to a fellow government, then the president says no, he doesn't think there's a problem, it's a democratic. I don't think it's not a good way to invoke democracy when you are almost interfering. And of course, now we are seeing this issue with the RSF in Nairobi now, and we are seeing some kind of intervention trying to sugarcoat that, what they had said here to launch a parallel government is not essentially what they actually been doing. And this is despite at least 2 delegations from Port Sudan trying to, stop the president or dissuade the president from hosting these meetings. And I think the other reason I would highlight is the quality of the diplomats we've been sending, in these capitals and in very important capitals such as, like in the neighboring countries, Uganda, Tanzania. And just checking among the politicians, the people we are sending in Uganda is a politician, Egypt is a politician. I don't think he understands the dynamics and might be not very conversant with diplomacy. And this is the same thing with Somalia. It's either retired people who are being posted to these missions, or politicians, political rejects who really don't understand or have not appreciated the whole conduct of diplomacy. And previously, we have been seeing complaints from the Ministry of the headquarters of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where the career diplomats who have been in the system for a while and who understand the foreign policy of Kenya historically, where it has been, and also this review and what is supposed to be achieved, complaining that first, even the progress within the service of the foreign service has not been rewarding. Secondly, when those opportunities come up, then it is the politicians who end up being posted to even, very important capitals such as, the US, Washington, and London. And so I think the quality of the human resource of the diplomatic service has been wanting, and increasingly some of the decisions that we are making and the reports we are filing back to the capital are not as rich enough. So I think those are some of the reasons I think I would highlight for now about why I think the influence of Kenya, or the Kenya standing in the region, has been dwindling. Yes, Mwangi.
Thank you, Eliud, for that. We have a question from Masaki. Masaki, can you hear me? Please shoot your question briefly and shortly.
No, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yes, my question is directed towards Nigeria, and it's with regard to the issue of science and technology. So I know we operate in a difficult environment within the Great Lakes region and the Horn of Africa with regard to peace and security issues. Does she feel as if these issues are negatively affecting one of our crucial pillars, which is the economic diplomacy pillar, and the comparative advantage that Kenya can gain with regard to its advanced position with regard to technology and science diplomacy? Are these issues of security negatively affecting and directing crucial resources which need to, and how can we leverage science and technology to boost economic growth and development? Thank you.
Nanjira, over to you.
Thanks, and thanks, Tuesday, for that question. I think if we want to have crutches and excuses, then yes, it will be a problem. I think part of the challenge for Kenya has been, we've been posturing on this idea of being a Silicon Savannah and a leader without showing our working. We have crutched on the M-Pesa success story, and sure, M-Pesa has expanded to a number of countries. When it comes to actually building the substantive aspect of the ecosystem, including what is supported domestically, even with innovations and all the startups and so on, there's been a lot that has been lacking, and that's created an atrophy of sorts that we have really not built upon. I'll give you an example. In science, we would imagine that, for example, issues to do with health, because this is also a regional hub for health, would be supporting a lot of strategic efforts, or even if it's just vaccines and spreading that more. But we see a lot of posturing than actual substantive doubling down on resources. And a good example is what we saw in the news today, that billions are being allocated to the executive and the office of the president, the deputy president, and the PCS. And the opportunity cost of those coins is actually not insignificant. Coupled with all the other ways we are seeing wastage, that's the money that should be going to actually supporting the stuff that makes us a science and technology and innovation leader. So we've been relying a lot on, say, maybe the grants, the development space and investors, but investors are having a harder and harder time coming at the level of entry that makes sense for them to meet these innovations or startups. So we have this, you saw it in the Economist headline not too long ago. We have too many businesses and not enough business. And I think this is an urgent issue to that question of economic diplomacy, that we need governments, to use the Kenyanism of sober governments and sobriety, to actually ask ourselves, what the hell are we doing and how are we going to get out of this rut? Because it's not the lack of innovations or opportunities. It is actually government policies and investments that are falling short of helping us unleash what is possible, and not just for ourselves, but really what we could do for the region. Because Nairobi, for me, as a capital, represents what is possible in this whole idea of Pan-Africanism. This is one city or one place that actually accommodates a lot of people from anywhere, both local, regional, and continental. And imagine if that energy was being tapped into, rather than seen as something just to be managed through problematic politics. So I think it's also a broader question of our national priorities, and that's why I always say, the domestic policy and foreign policy are twins, and you can't really look at one without the other. And the problem, lastly, is that we've been projecting an image that is not reflected authentically in what's happening at home, and that's where you have this idea of Sahani za Wageni as a sort of policy posture, where we're sharing, we were trying to present ourselves differently from what we actually are, and the citizens are not also being good, are not seen as authentic ambassadors when they are speaking their truth to how domestic and foreign policies relate to them. So there's much there that needs to be broader unpacking, but I think opportunity is always there. The missing link has always been how we implement them.
Thank you, Nanjira. We have Neema. Please shoot your question.
My question is also going to Nanjira regarding digital diplomacy. And of late, we've seen as youths that digital diplomacy, the use of X and also social media, all other social media platforms have been used to predict elections and turnouts in Africa. And to some level of concern, it's also a media of propaganda, especially with now most social media companies moving towards removing the fact checking whether something is propaganda or not. So with this rising global war in AI that's currently happening, we can see France and India are trying to develop their AI system and everything. So how can Kenyan use the Kenyan government using the youth match up to this kind of war and the use of social media to a positive spectrum, and maybe to match up later as we continue in our advancements as a democratic nation, also to match up with Estonia's government, which uses an e-citizen kind of system which connects all government institutions and registration. So how can do you first of all feel like Kenyan foreign policy undermines this kind of system, and how can we match up to them?
Really good questions, Emma. To match up to a country like Estonia is less about, some thing that we have to pull out of thin air, and really, again, just focusing and aligning. What you mentioned about the system that they use is called X-Road. Essentially what it does, it's almost like a back-end data exchange that minimizes how much data has to continually be collected by government agencies when you're seeking services. Technically, with this whole digital superhighway moment that we keep hearing about, those could be the kinds of things that would be informing how that digital superhighway and digitization of government services would go. But currently we have a situation where every entity that has been digitizing its services before they were sort of tried to be consolidated will do hectic data grabs, and especially on biometrics. You'll go to NTSA, for example, and you're trying to get a driver's license and they need your biometrics. Why? But when you're applying or reapplying for a national ID, you're still doing old school ink on paper. So it just shows the inconsistencies where you borrow a concept, but you don't really workshop it around what you're trying to do, because there are other political motivations around why that is happening. And that's what has us tripping around both our domestic and foreign policy around tech. It's really, really tragic when you read through this sessional paper to see how much the framing on public diplomacy and use of social media has been around this idea of misinformation and disinformation. And we've seen that being a government position that has been taken, including by the envoy in technology, where they really sort of muddied the waters and limited what we are seeing as a vibrant ecosystem in our country around the use of social media. In various ways, where misinformation and disinformation comes in is a function of politics, absolutely. But to frame it that all that is happening on these spaces has been propaganda or misinformation, disinformation, all media since the dawn of time has served that purpose. But it's really, really tragic to see how that has been brought into this document. And then the language that's used to talk about how we're going to address it is also very problematic, because it effective mechanisms, or they say appropriate methods for effective engagement with the media and the public, I presume, as part of strategic communications, which really to me has just said that this what I call the Sirikali mentality still holds, this idea that they will communicate to us what they think we need to know, and what we ask or what we are observing is to be minimized, or to bend to that will of what they put forward. And that's the challenge we are seeing, especially one on domestic issues, but because they're playing out on a platform as like, for example, X, which is both local and global, so to speak, you start to see that tension where, we're literally in a moment where it seems like it's government versus the people of Kenya. Then there's another problematic aspect to both the digital diplomacy and undercurrent in the paper around the role of the diaspora, almost as a hierarchy where they're the ones who know better, they're the ones who can be leveraged upon for skills and tech transfer to us, and not the other way around, where you see Kenyans themselves as an asset as they are and build upon that. And so those are real big tensions around even this question of what national values are. And even in the realm of tech, you just find that these are extensions of issues that have not been resolved, so to speak, in the analog. So it's not particularly unique, and these are the undercurrents that if we're being serious, we really, really have to address if we're going to unlock the potential we keep saying we want to have as a country.
Thank you, Nanjira, and thank you to Neema and Masaki for those questions. We have a flood of questions coming in, and while we can only read a few, rest assured that all of this feedback you are relaying, all of this feedback you are sending in is going to be relayed to the relevant state departments in order to be able to provide a clear picture of how foreign policy is resonating at Mashinani. I am going to read just but a few. I couldn't agree more with, this is Joylene Orutwa. She's saying, I couldn't agree more with the thoughts of Mr. Njira and Mr. Eliud. Failed politicians being sent to embassies and consulates is on the rise, especially in President Ruto's era. Wasn't that the same thing we were about to do with African Union Commission chairmanship? Interesting. We have a guy, Ogambi, who says, who is the official holder of the Kenyan foreign policy? And do we need to designate one official spokesperson of the ministry? Interesting questions. What are our aims and ends in science diplomacy? And are there ideas on setting up an office of science advisor? Sorry, I missed that question. And are there ideas on setting up an office of science advisor, attaché, at our embassies? We have Evans Kiuna who says, I'd like to hear Nanjira's insights on this. Also, what's the opportunity available for the collaboration across the African continent regarding science and innovation? She mentions building upon our local situation initiatives to bolster our diplomatic engagements. What's the place of citizens, county governments, and TVETs, specifically to science and tech diplomacy Mashinani? Nanjira.
First of all, can I just say that I really take issue with how they're calling public awareness foreign policy Mashinani and diaspora diplomacy Mashinani. Yani wanatuona, and it's the way, it's not that the Mashinani is the problem, it's the way they are framing it as if there's an infantilization and a condescension, and they really do need to explain why the Mashinani part. It assumes people don't know, people are stupid, and they have to be explained for, and it's a very problematic framing, and I hope that this is something we can convey to them. There's already one thing we have to be very clear, and I think we have to convey to the government of Kenya very clearly, is that the people are very aware. People are very attuned to these issues. Even if it's a so-called Wanjiku Mamamboga framing, what wanajua, people do know how these issues affect them because, again, the foreign policy is a mirror to domestic policy, simple as that. If we are not, charity begins at home. If it's not working at home, it's not going to work abroad. And that's why we're having this tension where, for example, with the AUC candidacy, Kenyans were very clear that they ran a very effective campaign because they felt that the Kenyan government was not presenting its best foot forward as far as a representative we would have wanted as a people to be sent to that space. And these are real issues. They can, they can assume, you can call them misinformation all you want, but these are the realities that we have to contend with. And they're sort of non-tangibles that really breathe life to these kinds of documents. On the African continent regarding science and innovation, here's where I would hope to see Kenyan leadership, for example, the true leadership that we keep trying to assert ourselves into, to work with different governments, whether it's the minilaterals, whether it's a coalition of like-minded actors, to figure out what are the comparative strengths we have. Because if we're all pursuing the same thing, okay, let's take AI, which is a big one right now. You have Nigeria, for example, that's working on a national level large language model, which is fascinating. But there's something about the principles that African researchers are calling to be embraced that are markedly different from how the AI race has been going. This idea of using a community-based approach where you actually work with communities to actually, collect data sets, own data sets, and really because it's embodying the idea that language is not just language, but carriers of culture. So if Nigeria is working on that, what if we work on the compute aspect first, even as we pursue other things like LLMs, and we find those comparative strengths? Because until the continent lets realize that we need to figure out ways to work in collaboration, not in competition, we're going to keep playing for small. And there's this narcissism of small things. We keep doing pilot projects, we keep doing small micro enterprises that are not even supported to last, and this is a problem. TVET is also particularly problematic for me because it creates this idea of there's something like practical skills, as if people do not deserve to have knowledge or insights just by virtue of being a human being. So sure, you can go to a TVET, and I think it's been really tragic that TVETs had business courses that were taken away. This idea you can just be trained one particular narrow skill, and then you're employable or practical with a practical skill. And now with this weird warped foreign policy priority of shipping jobs abroad. So there's a lot of inconsistencies we really do need to map out, because why would you train your talent only to send it abroad? That has been the priority. And if you look at this particular foreign policy, what's striking me mostly as an oddity is how well articulated questions of diaspora are versus things like science, technology, and innovation. So this is idea of the pipeline from remittances from, for diaspora, expanding the diaspora and bringing back remittances, than really thinking about, again, the domestic and the fact that this would be how we project ourselves and our national interest to this broader question of what our national interests are. Very quickly, I saw the question Bob asked, and I wanted to touch upon it, which is on subnational diplomacy, which is missing. And subnational diplomacy would be the idea that, cities and counties would actually engage in foreign policy. They're mentioned, at least county governments are mentioned in the document in collaboration with the national government, and all these investment forums have been hosting have been highlighted as an example. But we keep hearing, for example, Nairobi hosts UNEP, which is a very talking point. There was a time the PS had talked about Nairobi as a multilateral hub for the Global South. These are not concepts that were developed because it does beg the question of what would it mean to be a proper actor as a city, because cities are bearing the brunt of very interesting foreign policy issues in as much as they are part of a broader national spectrum. So again, it really does beg the question, to Cheporil's point, who was involved in this conversation? Is this already set in stone, that there is the public participation process that the Parliament has called for? So this could be some of the ideas that we put forth. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Nanjira. We have less than 50 seconds to wrap up this webinar. Dr. Owiso, please. I want to divide the 50 seconds, 25 each, you and Chepkoril, so that you give your final remarks as we wrap up this webinar. Dr. Owiso.
Thank you, Mwangi. Just a quick one, especially looping on to what Chepkoril mentioned about our practice not matching what's on paper. I believe that this should not come, whatever practice we have should not come at the expense of international issues for which principled positions are required. We may then be accused, and rightly so, of acting as if we have no principles that inform our relationship with other members of the human family. And I believe that the foreign policy should be developed in light of our national values as articulated in the Constitution. We do not live in a vacuum. And then finally, if at all there's still some space left in the foreign policy document development, I would love to see a very prominent role for the foreign service, despite what the document says, has a very expansive role as articulated in the Foreign Service Act of 2021. We should look at it more beyond it just being a human resource sort of training institute. It is positioned in such a way that it can provide the needed guidance and serve as a fulcrum for all these policy positions that we are trying to articulate. And I think I'll stop at that, and hopefully there'll be a next time for us to speak more about these things.
Thank you, Dr. Owiso. Ms. Chepkoril Sambu.
Yes, I mean, Nanjira talked about Sahani Zawagini, and the document is full of Pan-Africanism. And I am wondering why issues like reparations are left out of the document, which are supposed to be very Pan-African issues. Yes, I'm done. That was just yeah.
Thank you so much, Nanjira. Thank you so much, Dr. Owiso, who is an international law practitioner. We had Mr. Eliud Kibi, he's a seasoned journalist and analyst on international and diplomatic affairs. We had the final speaker, Ms. Chepkoril Sambu. She's a researcher focusing on conflicts, politics, peace, and politics in Eastern Africa. Then we had Ms. Nanjira Sambuli, who is a researcher and analyst on tech policy and international affairs. We had Dr. Kizito Sabala, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Nairobi and the chairperson of the International Relations Society of Kenya. And finally, we had Dr. Koril Sing'oei, who is the Principal Secretary, Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Foreign and Diaspora Affairs. I am Mwangi Maina. Thank you guys for joining this particular webinar. We believe that we will be able to shape conversations. We will keep on having such webinars so that we are able to relay all this information to you. As they say, is that in diplomacy, words are weapons, but so is silence. What Kenya chooses to say or not say on global and regional affairs will determine its trajectory in the years ahead. Thank you for being part of this webinar. Once again, this important conversation. Let's keep the discussion ongoing on Twitter Live beyond this webinar. We hope to organize another webinar in future or in coming times. Asanteni sana.